Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from today. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3, where we'll focus on an overview of the changes between the R2 2013 version of the standard and the current revision R2V3. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EH&S Program Manager with PJR. So again, welcome. I have a brief agenda on the first slide here. We're going to talk a little bit about Perry Johnson registrars, who we are, what we do. We'll cover the benefits of certification to a standard like R2, cover the transition timeline information for anyone who is still going through the transition at this time. We'll spend the bulk of the time going through the key changes and revisions between the two standards. We'll close with a summary of the certification process for anyone who might be pursuing initial certification instead of transitioning, and we'll allow time for questions at the end. So feel free to type them into the questions field at any point during the presentation, and we'll save time for those at the end. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading certification bodies in the world. We have certified companies to a variety of standards around the world. This is not an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a registrar. We're accredited to grant certifications, as I said, for a wide variety of standards. And today we are discussing the R2 standard. We're currently accredited to both versions, R2 2013 and R2V3, until after the R2 2013 standard has eclipsed. Benefits of certification vary by organization and industry, but generally these are the most common benefits of certification or drivers for certification. The standard represents a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics and electronic components. So being able to advertise that commitment alongside the certification is one of the main benefits. One of the other main benefits to certification is improvements to the organization's environmental health and safety performance with the standard prerequisites that R2V3 has, plus the additional requirements depending on your processes and appendices that you're qualified to for R2V3. You'll see additional environmental health and safety requirements. Another benefit of certification is the framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. In meeting the requirements of the standard, which outline not only legal and other compliance, but important export requirements, adhering to the standard allows those requirements to be met through knowledge of the requirements and operational controls to adhere to them. Another benefit or output of certification would be efforts towards management commitment and employee engagement, increasing levels of commitment and engagement, again, by meeting the requirements of the standard. That will be one of the outputs and is beneficial to companies of varying sizes. The certification can provide a competitive advantage and/or improve public image. Again, being able to advertise that certification and what it represents, the commitment it represents, can go a long way in earning bids that you might not have achieved without the certification, and just how sustainable or responsible the organization is perceived to be. In addition to those competitive advantages, there could be other financial benefits in some areas. For example, there may be insurance discounts for holding certain types of certifications. Being able to achieve strategic objectives and stakeholder requirements through adhering to the standard is another benefit. and the standard can be integrated with other business management systems. So those are some of the most common benefits of certification. For clients who are certified to R2 2013, these next couple slides are for you. We'll talk about the transition expectations. The R2V3 standard was published several years ago already, and can be found on CERI's website, along with other relevant documentation, including the REC, which we'll talk about shortly. CERI's transition expectations are memorialized in Advisory 22, that's the transition plan, and the Code of Practices. All of those can be found on CERI's website. I also want to mention, probably the first of several times during this webinar, the CERI knowledge base. So CERI's website contains a portion called the knowledge base. In lieu of a formal guidance document, CERI is often adding to the content of that knowledge base site with articles, Q&As, podcasts, training materials, interpretations, and a whole host of other reference material. So I highly encourage everyone to check for information on the knowledge base, get comfortable with the knowledge base and the content that's already there. Check there when you have specific questions, and to utilize that resource as it is a valuable resource. As far as transition audits go, they are allowed to be partially or fully virtual with additional requirements. So I do like to throw that out there. If you're planning for your transition and you're wondering if it's even allowed to go virtually, the short answer is yes, it can potentially go virtually. We do some pre-screening to make sure the management system and the facility can support a virtual audit effectively. And then CERI imposes some additional requirements if it's going to be fully virtual. So we would make you aware of those at the time. There has been a staggered transition timeline where the deadline to transition is based on where you fall in your audit cycle. You do have to transition at recertification. And then for those that didn't recertify during that period, they meet the overall transition deadline, which is June 30th, 2023. PJR has published its own transition plan available on our website. And we did identify an internal deadline by which the audits themselves have to occur in order for us to guarantee no lapse in certification or make it much less likely for there to be a lapse in certification. In other words, with an overall deadline of June 30th, you couldn't have your audit at the beginning of June. Any outcomes of the audit, including nonconformities, could delay the issuance of that certificate before the deadline. Things need to be resolved and technically reviewed before a certificate can be issued. So there are post-audit activities that we need to account for, hence the sooner deadline outlined by PJR. If you haven't already planned your transition with your scheduler, I highly encourage you to do that today. This goes through the transition deadlines. I already briefly summarized them. We're already a good portion of the way through the transition period, so I'm not going to go through the entirety of this slide. We're already really through these first two bullet points anyway. So at this stage of the game, if you are recertifying, you're definitely transitioning. If you are not due to recertify in 2022, then you have the option of whether you're going to transition in 2022 or early, Q1 2023. And that is really based on when your audit typically falls in the calendar year. We're seeing some clients who had their annual audits earlier this year, opting to stay with R2 2013 for one more audit and then have their 2023 audit perhaps a little earlier than usual. But for those clients who fall with audits later in the calendar year, they're transitioning in 2022 so as to avoid having an audit Q4 of 2022 and again in Q1 2023, which would be the reality if they didn't transition in 2022. Again, the overall deadline is June 30th, 2023. I did put this in a timeline format for some visual representation. However, again, we're a good portion through the transition period already, so this isn't maybe as helpful as it once was. For the purposes of today's webinar, where we're focusing on the changes between R2 2013 and R2V3, I'm making some assumptions here that the majority of the people who've been attending this webinar are those transitioning, already certified to R2 2013 and just trying to feel more prepared for their R2V3 transition. This is less of a standard overview webinar and more of a what's changed, what are the changes, what are the things that I need to know as I prepare to transition. So I'm not going to go through the reasons why the standard was revised at great length. It was revised for some of the same reasons that all standards get revised, to ensure it continues to be relevant and compatible, easy to implement, easy to use, things like that, and free from ambiguity. In addition to that, the changes took into account lessons learned by Siri, feedback from the TAC, public comments, which can be from customers, auditors, certification bodies, consultants, anyone within the industry. And there is a lot of diversity in the industry, so the standard continues to try and adapt to represent or be inclusive of that diversity. Obviously, they want the standard to be effectively implemented and have its intent be achieved, and remove any sources of confusion. So at a very high level, those are the drivers behind the revision. I want to spend the majority of the time on the changes. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to type them into the chat. So again, key changes in the R2V3 standard. This is where we're going to focus our time. I want to make clear that the intent of the standard is unchanged. The intent for prioritizing reuse of electronics over any other processing methodologies is still the same. The hierarchy of reuse, or the hierarchy of responsible management of those recyclables, is the same. Reuse should be prioritized to avoid scrapping electronics that could still have reuse value or could be repaired and repurposed. So the intent is unchanged. You can see from this snapshot of the table of contents that the format of the standard is different. The standard has been divided into two sections: the core requirements and the process requirements, also known as appendices. Whereas the core requirements apply to all R2V3 facilities, the process requirements will not all apply. It will be, each of the appendices will be applied if relevant, based on an R2V3 facility's processing methodologies and the types of electronics they process. And we'll get more into that as we go through the presentation. There is even more emphasis on reuse in the R2V3 standard, not less. Some requirements are undoubtedly more prescriptive, and the bar has been raised in terms of data security, testing, and repair expectations. Now, instead of 13 provisions, we see 10 core requirements, and to be used hand in hand with the standard is the REC. I mentioned this earlier. That stands for the R2 Equipment Categorization Document, and we will talk briefly about that again soon. Another key change in R2V3 is the addition of a certified QMS to the standard prerequisites for R2V3 facilities, depending on the process requirements or appendices to which they qualify. So when we get into the process requirements, we'll go through this again. But looking at the table of contents here, if you are qualifying for Appendix C, D, and or F, in addition to the EH&S standard requirements, you will also be required to add a QMS certification, such as ISO 9001, RIOS, and a handful of other approved standards if you don't already have one. We're going to go through section by section, not touching on all of the requirements, but trying to highlight as many of the changes as time allows. The first section is the introduction, with no significant changes to the comprehensiveness, legality of trade expectations, or applicability. What is new in the introduction is references to the rec, which again can be downloaded from Siri's website and is expected to be used in conjunction with the standard. It's not auditable, but it does provide an outline of evaluation and grading requirements, and adherence to the rec is required for R2V3 certification. Where the categories themselves don't need to be used verbatim, if you choose to use different category names or categorization processes, there does need to exist a cross-reference to correlate the rec categories with the R2 facilities categories. Similarly, no significant changes to the auditability of R2 requirements or documents. We still have a code of practices, although the R2V3 has its own version, and the general auditing requirements continue to apply. The certificates for R2V3 will look a bit different, as the standard and the code of practices require listing of several types of information, including any process requirements or appendices to which the client is certified. So you'll see those listed out on the certificate. Those process requirements or appendices also affect the scope as prescribed by the R2V3 Code of Practices, and we'll get into that shortly. There are a number of new and revised definitions, so we do encourage you to review those. We won't be going through those today, but I've included that slide as a summary to draw your attention to the terms that you may or may not already be familiar with. Some things are really and truly new in R2V3, like R2 controlled streams and unrestricted streams, so you will want to get familiar with those terms in particular. Getting into the core requirements themselves, core requirement 1 represents scope. So this talks not just about the certificate scope language, which will be further defined in the Code of Practices, but also what the scope of those audits represent, what needs to be included, what can't be excluded. So the audits in the certification need to include all used electronic equipment, components, and materials managed. You don't get to pick and choose what is within the scope if it's being processed at the facility. All processes and activities undertaken at the facility also need to be included. Again, no picking and choosing. If it's an R2 certifiable activity happening at that same address, it does need to be included. Any external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification, if there are any, would be fair game as well. All of the core requirements, again, they apply to all R2V3 facilities, as well as any applicable process requirements or appendices given the R2 facility's scope. Services outside of the facility, but still related to a facility's operations, might include things like off-site electronic collection, mobile data destruction. Some companies have mobile shredders, for example, any services performed at a customer site, and so on. So keep those things in mind when you are preparing or starting to think about what needs to be included in your audits. Again, the certificate is required to reflect certain information, including the scope and the applicable process requirements. There aren't currently any allowances, as well as all legal names and legal entities associated with those certifiable activities at the R2V3 facility. A new requirement in R2V3 is to publicly communicate on an ongoing basis and keeping this information current any locations that are not certified to R2 but are owned and or operated by the R2 facility and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So just as with R2 2013, the standard doesn't require that all your locations pursue certification. However, the advertising expectations are more stringent in R2V3 by requiring you to specifically communicate this information to the public. Another new requirement is to be prohibited from achieving certification for 2 years if SERI identifies an organization as having deceptively advertised or fraudulently advertised, participated in illegal activities, and anything else they deem appropriate to be listed as an organization that has to wait a certain period of time to be able to achieve certification. There are no significant changes to the hierarchy as the intent of the standard is the same. And we see just updated references to the formatting of the standard throughout this section. So core requirement 6, for example, is referenced, and we'll touch on that more later. Core requirement 3 focuses on the EH&S requirements. The EH&S prerequisites are still in place. An organization needs either ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, or instead of both of those could have the RIOS standard, which includes environmental health and safety. Interestingly, RIOS also includes quality. So for those companies we touched on earlier who might qualify for appendices C, D, and or F, and may need to consider adding a certified QMS, RIOS would fulfill all 3 of those QEHS requirements. Core requirement 3 itself requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. I've listed some examples. You can find those in the standard as well. The requirements for actually testing or controlling those come elsewhere. This is really about identifying the aspects and hazards, assessing the risk at this stage of the game. This section also specifies minimum accommodations and requirements for workers. There are some additional requirements within that section, but they go hand in hand with those expectations for workers. Core requirement 4 focuses on legal and other requirements. Just as with the previous version of the standard, legal requirements regarding import and export are stressed. This includes legal requirements for export, countries of transit, and or import to be able to demonstrate that those international shipments are legal. This applies very clearly in the standard to both equipment, components, and materials transferred directly by the R2 facility, as well as any R2 controlled streams shipped by downstream vendors through final disposition. The only caveat, or not caveat, the end point would be either, as I said, final disposition, end of life, or being able to stop at the first R2V3 facility in the recycling chain with the understanding that that company's R2V3 audit and certification will fulfill the requirements for the rest of the recycling chain. So again, the need to verify import and export legality falls on the R2V3 facility, whether they are shipping it out of their facility to an international destination or sending it to a different company within the same country who is then going to turn around and export it. The requirements are the same. If it's in your recycling chain, if those international locations are in your recycling chain, you need to have evidence to ensure the shipments are legal unless there's an R2V3 facility in the middle. Core Requirement 4 also requires prompt corrective actions to address any compliance violations and requires the R2 facility to notify their CB if they receive a notice of violation requiring action and/or following up with the issuing facility within 30 days. In addition to the requirements we see in Core 3, Core 4 houses some additional worker protection requirements. Child and forced labor is prohibited. Prison labor is prohibited unless specified conditions are met. And new to R2V3, a non-discrimination policy is required, and the criteria are detailed in Core 4. Core 5 focuses on tracking throughput. The concept of tracking throughput is not new to R2V3, but the expectations within it are definitely different. It requires a summary report of inbound and outbound transactions. All transactions need to be accounted for. And this goes beyond the concept of taking physical possession and bringing something into the facility. This talks about control. And for those that were certified to R220 or 13, the concept of control is not a new one. It's not about ownership or even about physical possession, but control. So brokers would still be subject to the tracking throughput requirements of Core Requirement 5. SIRI and R2V3 are definitely looking for detail here. The reports, the records need to be detailed and accurate. So records should have accurate dates, detailed descriptions, and this information should be accounted for all inbound and outbound materials. Total inventory levels need to be maintained below any applicable limits, such as defined by applicable legal requirements or an R2 facility's closure plan. Core Requirement 5 introduces the term negative value material, which is either defined within the standard or on that SIRI knowledge base I was talking about earlier. So this is another new concept for a lot of people. You're definitely going to want to get familiar with this as well. It would be easy to say, oh, that doesn't apply to us, but that could very well be a mistake. So do get familiar with that term. This requirement within Core 5 speaks to not storing R2 controlled streams, another term you want to get familiar with, or materials with a negative value for more than 1 year. There are some exceptions, including components that have been inventoried after testing for maybe reuse, repair parts, for example, or to be sold. They've been tested, confirmed to have resale value, and they're awaiting sale. They can be stored longer. The other exception would be instances where export approval is still pending. And this is making an assumption that the paperwork was completed by the R2 facility on time and the holdup is out of their control, waiting on the relevant governing authority to give that authorization. So those would be the exceptions to the 1 year rule. You want to make sure you understand what qualifies as an R2 controlled stream and negative value materials to correctly identify that. Course 6 is where we get into the sorting, categorization, and processing requirements, and this section is significantly restructured. This is also where we see references to the REC. Course 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing controlled and processed materials, and it is very prescriptive as to what needs to be included and accounted for, and it needs to adhere to Core 2 to ensure the hierarchy is followed. It needs to correlate and apply the requirements of the REC. The categorization needs to include functionality, cosmetic condition, and data sanitization status. The process also needs to identify data storage devices. It needs to include instructions for determining reuse potential, ensuring that there's a market, for example, and any reevaluation steps that might be needed when an R2 controlled stream category changes. And this might change throughout processing. It may change categories as it goes through processing. Everything needs to be processed as an R2 controlled stream unless it is determined not to be an R2 controlled stream, where you need to be really familiar with that definition, or it meets one of these other requirements. For example, if your upstream is an R2V3 certified facility, not R2 2013, but R2V3 certified facility, and they're giving you a REC category, you can recognize that REC category relying on their R2V3 certification. If the upstream is not R2V3 certified, then these are your remaining options, these two in the middle here. You can either have information about their processes to confirm that they meet the R2V3 expectations and then perform a sampling, or you could retest and sanitize everything. Oops, sorry. So again, if they're not R2V3, the upstream, there are additional expectations for either sampling after confirming the process meets the expectations, or retesting and sanitizing everything to be able to meet the requirements instead of relying on that upstream. All equipment or components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified by the REC. And these data evaluations need to include any connected user accounts and services. As I mentioned, the bar is raised for testing, for data security, and for repair. Any equipment or components that may contain data need to be controlled according to Core 7, which we'll get to next. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused or sold would be processed through Core 7 and Appendix E, which is materials recovery, and we'll talk more about both of those things. There are identification requirements for equipment or components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse. And there are specific requirements for electronics or components that have been evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream, which is another R2V3 term. It's got to meet the REC requirements, and then subsequently they need to be handled separately from the R2 controlled streams. The justification for that classification has to be maintained. Tracking records also need to be maintained, including any reason for return. There are also specific requirements in Core 6 for transferring functioning products, equipment or components that demonstrated functionality per the REC. I'm not going to get into all of these. We don't have enough time to go through at that level of detail. Physical labels are not necessarily required to meet the unique identifier expectations in Core 6. You can also use barcodes or other means of identification and tracking. There are no significant changes to collectible and specialty electronics requirements, however. Core 7 focuses on data security. It requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address the prescribed subject matter in Core 7. So before I go any further with Core 7, I want to remind everyone that all of the core requirements apply to all R2V3 facilities. Even if your scope of processing doesn't deal with data-bearing media, adherence to Core 7 is required. You still need that data sanitization plan. You need a plan that meets the standard requirements for what would be done if material, including data, were to be received. So I've listed some examples here of what can be found in Core 7. There is quite a bit: security, identification of types of data storage media, methods for handling the data. There's a whole host of requirements. There's also a requirement for a written data security policy, including the need to assign a competent data protection representative. Risk of theft and unauthorized access need to be considered as part of the security program, and all of these are required whether or not you plan to receive data-bearing media. Additionally, there are security permission level requirements to control access as relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of data received, any applicable legal and other requirements that could include customer requirements, and so on. And all of that needs to be approved or authorized by that data protection representative we just mentioned. Written acknowledgements are also required for anyone who is granted that additional security authorization. An incident response procedure is required for breaches of data and security. And a process for 100% effectiveness for data destruction processes is required. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor that doesn't have to be fulfilled in-house, just as in R2 2013. A written contract is required if you're going to send data-bearing media to a downstream vendor for destruction. That would be handled through Appendix A, downstream recycling chain, with additional requirements for sanitization and destruction activities if not being performed by the R2V3 facility. Core 7 also requires at least annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the data sanitization processes, and this needs to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. Lastly, Core 7 requires a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, including changes to downstream vendors receiving their material and any security breaches. Core 8 covers focus materials. It houses requirements for demonstrating the recycling chain, has the expertise and capability to process the focus materials as required by the standard. It also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when the R2V3 facility is not the end-of-life processing facility. So when there are downstream vendors involved, this would include mapping out that flow all the way through final disposition or to the first R2V3 tier, again, not R2 2013. In R2V3, alkaline batteries are managed under core requirement 2. So if they don't contain mercury in R2V3, they wouldn't be considered focus materials, but they would be managed under Core 2 along with print cartridges. However, on the flip side, unlike R2 2013, lead-free circuit boards are now considered focus materials. So you don't need to worry about a T-clip to try and prove that they are lead-free. They're going to be considered a focus material regardless. Core 9 facility requirements cover a variety of storage and closure expectations. Indoor processing is required, except for instances where the outdoor operations have been adequately assessed for risk and release potential is adequately controlled. Indoor storage is also required, except for items that are intended for outdoor use. We're focusing on reuse here when we talk about indoor storage, but it does include all R2 controlled streams. Appropriate insurance coverage is required as well. The closure plan requirements are found in Core 9. That's not new to R2V3. We had closure plan expectations in R2 2013 as well, although R2V3 does require the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage those electronics left under its control. So that looks a little bit different than the R2 2013 verbiage. In R2V3, there are called out some exceptions for the need to hold a financial instrument to cover those closure costs in the event of abandonment. There were no exclusions to this in R2 2013, so it is a difference between the two versions of the standard. However, to meet the exception criteria, you need to meet all 3 bullet points, not just 1 or 2 of them. You need to meet all 3, and you need to be able to demonstrate to the auditor that you meet those exception criteria in lieu of holding those financial instrument funds. Core 10, the last core requirement, focuses on transport. The packaging for transportation needs to be secure and meet core requirements 7 and 4 requirements as applicable. So what data security requirements are relevant, what legal and other requirements are relevant depending on the electronics being packaged. There are additional requirements in Core 10 even for transporting data containing equipment or components, including implementing defined security measures, tracking shipments, enforcing contracts with transporters, and utilizing further packaging and security controls during transport. Core 10 also requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, and declarations in compliance with any applicable regulatory requirements. So that accounts for the 10 core requirements that apply to all organizations. And then the second half of the standard is the process requirements, or the appendices. We're going to go through these process requirements more quickly. They won't all apply to all organizations, and I do want to save time for questions at the end. Appendix A covers downstream recycling chain expectations. So this is where we find the downstream due diligence expectations, like in R2 2013, although there are additional requirements for R2V3. A company would qualify for Appendix A if they are not the end-of-life facility and are sending material to a downstream vendor for further processing. There are a whole host of requirements in Appendix A that we're not going to get into today. There are differences, though, in the downstream due diligence requirements, depending on whether the Tier 1 is R2V3 certified or not R2V3 certified. Okay. Appendix B focuses on data sanitization. This will apply to organizations that are doing logical sanitization, physical sanitization, or both. If those processes are performed by a downstream vendor instead, or physical destruction is performed according to the requirements in the core and not in Core 7, not Appendix B, then you would not, that organization would not qualify for Appendix B. Perhaps a downstream vendor would, or perhaps the material is being sent for materials recovery, which is Appendix E, and we'll get to that shortly. Appendix C focuses on test and repair. This is the first appendix we see that requires a certified QMS. And this is for organizations that are doing at least some portion of the testing, repair, refurbishing activities. This would not be required for organizations that are just doing a pre-sort to establish reuse potential and then sending material to a downstream vendor to be tested. So that downstream vendor would be fulfilling Appendix C instead. Appendix D covers specialty electronics. This is where an organization doesn't have the capability to test, but does receive some types of specialty electronics. This is outside the 1% limit that is allowed within the standard without needing Appendix D. I do want to note Appendix D is another one of those appendices or process requirements that requires a certified QMS. And also to qualify for D, you must also have Appendix C. Okay, so we're not going to go into any more detail about the appendices than this high-level overview. Appendix E covers materials recovery. This is inclusive of destructive dismantling, going beyond the manual dismantling that might be used to harvest parts for reuse and repair, for example. If you are dismantling for recycling rather than reuse, you likely fall under Appendix E to some extent. Destructive dismantling is one type of materials recovery. You could also have other methods of processing for materials recovery, including mechanical separation, chemical treatment, thermal treatment. So the whole electronics shredders, the smelters, as well as those doing destructive dismantling where they're really breaking the electronics apart, getting them down to their components before sending them downstream. All of those would fall under materials recovery. Appendix F covers brokering, and this is the last, well, it's the last appendix, but it's also the last appendix that requires a certified QMS. And then the two types of brokers would be those that have a location and take physical possession of the material, and the types of brokers that don't take physical possession of the material and just direct shipment from the upstream right to the downstream. So there are still requirements for brokers. Brokers can achieve R2V3 certification through this appendix. We're not going to spend more than a moment or two on the rec either. The rec is used in conjunction with the standard, although it by itself is not auditable. You can't have a finding written against the rec. It is required that you're implementing the requirements of the rec. The findings would be written against the core requirements instead. So again, we spoke earlier about the categories. They can be used as exactly found in the rec or through a cross-reference. That's up to the organization. Not all categories in the rec will apply, and as mentioned before, detailed descriptions are still required. So I've just included some screenshots of the rec to get you a little bit more familiar with it. It outlines processing categories. It covers R2 applicability. We mentioned these terms, R2 controlled streams and unrestricted streams. It also goes on to talk about planned returns and what may fall into that category. There's a popular article on the CIRI knowledge base about planned returns to clarify and address some confusion in the industry that the planned returns are the exception to the rule. Receiving material, sorting it, doing some testing, and then only keeping a subset of what was sent as a method of doing business does not suffice to these expectations. These would be one-offs, the exceptions to the rule. Also assessing the sanitization status or the presence of data and categorizing them accordingly. Functionality categories, including cosmetic and functionality descriptors. And then there's some correlating examples in the rec as well, how to link the two together. Again, you can use these or use a cross-reference for your own. There are other relevant changes that coincide to R2V3 transition and R2V3 certification that may not be within the standard themselves. The code of practice, for example, contains a number of requirements to which the certification body is subject, but since those requirements do flow down to our clients, I included that information here as an overview as well. The code of practice requires, for example, what we call the contract validation prior to a stage 1 or an R2V3 transition to ensure R2V3 eligibility and to set the audit up for success by trying to really hone in on those applicable appendices, confirm the eligibility, work on some scoping, and try and get some of the more significant issues identified up front. There are changes to the schemes or certification structures for R2V3 organizations. For example, multi-sites are no longer permitted. So I know there's a learning curve with that as well. That's another thing that we try and flesh out if we haven't already confirmed that during the contract validation. The code of practice requires that at least one of the 2 surveillance audits be on site every cycle. It also requires stage 2 and recertification audits to be on site. So it only allows post-transition 1 surveillance audit per cycle to be potentially virtual. So that's a R2V3 requirement, not necessarily a PJR requirement. It also requires revisits for all R2V3 NCRs, even minor NCRs, and specifies timeframes to close them. The ramifications for not adhering to those timeframes or deadlines are fairly significant. They include suspension, starting over with a new initial certification audit. Those are steep consequences. So we'll need to adhere to those timeframes specified by the R2V3 Code of Practices. And I like to put that information out there during my webinars as well. Lastly, I will summarize the certification process for anyone who may be pursuing initial certification, and then we'll get to any questions you might have. So before you can get very far, you'll need a copy of the standard itself, and you'll work on establishing documentation as required by the standard. Conduct any training required by the standard to support the management system, and implement any management system requirements. This includes conducting an internal audit, conducting a compliance evaluation, and a management review after the first 2 have been done so that the outputs from those audits can serve as inputs to the management review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body like PJR to perform those audits, and you'll need to submit any information required or requested by the CB to support those pre-qualification activities, what we call the contract validation. The contract validation fulfills requirements in the code of practice before the audit can proceed. Then, assuming we're talking about initial certification here, you'll complete your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. Conversely, if you're transitioning, it won't be a stage 1 and stage 2 audit, but you will still resolve the nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. I mentioned the contract validation. That's typically a quarter day to a half day in duration, depending on whether you are a new client or a transitioning client and how many requirements in the um, code of practice we're fulfilling with that activity. Stage 1 audit needs to take place, which is primarily a documentation review confirming readiness to stage 2. The stage 2 is a full system audit, sampling all the requirements of the standard, all the processes, all of the shifts, to really get a sense of how effectively the standard requirements have been implemented. Any nonconformities identified do need to be resolved before moving forward. And the R2V3 Stage 2 audits, as I mentioned earlier, are required to be on site by the R2V3 Code of Practices. Once certified, you enter the 3-year surveillance cycle, where the first 2 years are consisting of annual or semi-annual surveillance audits. Those are shorter in duration than the stage 2 and consist of partial system audits, unlike the stage 2. The 3rd year in the cycle represents the recertification audit, another full system audit like the stage 2 to start the cycle all over. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and type any questions that you might have, and I'm going to see if there were any to share. I went through that really quickly, so I'll hang out in case you're typing. I wanted to make sure we got through all the slides with a couple minutes for questions. Okay, so far I don't see any questions, so just in case anyone's going to log off, I wanted to say thank you for attending today's webinar. Feel free to check back. We have a variety of webinars that we offer over the course of the next couple of weeks and months. We rotate through some of the more popular topics, but we do keep the content updated if there are changes, so feel free to tune back in. We have another R2V3 webinar that focuses on some of the common NCRs and lessons learned as we've been auditing R2V3 for a bit now, so we can share some of those learnings with our clients. We have webinars on the subject of RIOS, ISO 45001. We talk about e-stewards. So feel free to tune into any of those that might be helpful to you as well. And a recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides, will be available on PJR's website. Maybe I can save someone from typing out that question. I normally mention it, but I did forget about that. So again, a recording as well as a copy of the slides will be available on PJR's website in the near future from today's webinar. I still don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've got your transition audit coming up, I hope this content was helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'll leave my contact information here for a moment. You can contact me via email, amatthews@pjr.com, or through the main PJR line. They can put you through to my extension. And if you are a prospective client looking for a quote or to start the certification process, I've also included the contact information for the sales team. Have a great afternoon and have a great weekend, everyone.